What if I told you that in the dense forests of upstate New York, beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned church, lay the skeletons of 143 men, women, and children, every single one tortured in ways so methodical, so ritualistic, that modern investigators still call it America's most terrifying hidden cult. This isn't some urban legend whispered around a campfire. This is a true story buried for over 160 years, locked away in federal archives, hidden from the public eye until now. In a country obsessed with true crime, cult horror, and forbidden history, few secrets remain as chilling as the legacy of the Church of the Pure Spirit. The tale begins in the early 19th century, when America was ablaze with religious fervor during the Second Great Awakening. Tiny settlements like Ravenwood, nestled about 40 miles north of Albany, became fertile ground for preachers promising salvation. But what arrived in Ravenwood in 1825 wasn't salvation, it was the seed of something monstrous. 3 brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft walked into town with piercing eyes, pockets full of cash, and a doctrine that twisted suffering into sanctity. They built a church of dark stone, unlike anything seen in New England. Its sanctuary windowless, lit only by lanterns flickering against cold walls. Locals thought they were eccentric. No one guessed they were laying the foundations of a secret society, whose rituals would redefine the boundaries between faith and horror. Purification through pain, they preached, quoting scripture, weaving fire and brimstone into the promise of eternal salvation. At first, the rituals seemed harmless vigils, fasting, ice-cold water to drown the sinful self. But like the proverbial frog in slowly boiling water, Ravenwood's faithful didn't realize how deep the darkness would pull them until it was far too late. Tonight, we open the sealed records. Tonight, we step into the catacombs. This is the hidden history of America's most horrifying cult. A story of ritual torture, mass murder, and secrets that still echo in the shadows. If you're fascinated by forbidden history, secret cults, ritual horror, and true crime stories the government doesn't want you to know, then buckle in. Because the Church of the Pure Spirit was more than a cult. It was a machine for evil that may still be ticking, just beyond the edges of American history. Imagine stumbling upon an abandoned church deep in the forests of upstate New York, only to discover that beneath its rotting floorboards lie the skeletons of 143 souls. Every bone etched with marks of torture and unspeakable suffering, a discovery so dark that it remained locked away in federal vaults for more than a century and a half. This isn't a ghost story meant to send chills down your spine on a stormy night. This is real American history. One of the most chilling chapters you've probably never heard, and one that even today continues to cast a long, ominous shadow over the soil where it all began. It's the kind of forbidden history that historians whisper about, that true crime obsessives crave, and that governments often wish would stay buried. In the summer of 1862, during the height of the Civil War, a small team of local surveyors was tasked with mapping the boundaries of an old property about 40 miles north of Albany. The locals had always considered the place cursed, its church building abandoned since before the war. For decades, rumors lingered of strange lights flickering in the woods, of chanting that rose and fell like the wind, of townsfolk who disappeared without a trace. But no one imagined what lay beneath the surface. When surveyors broke through the buckling wooden floorboards, they uncovered a mass grave. The skeletons laid out in perfect rows, as though placed there deliberately. Each skeleton bore signs of systematic torture, bones fractured and then healed, suggesting injuries inflicted over time rather than in a single violent outburst. Deep grooves and carvings etched into the ribs and long bones, forming symbols no one could readily identify. Evidence of repeated near drowning, with the sinus cavities showing signs of repeated water aspiration. Authorities were called in, and soon federal officials descended upon the tiny town of Ravenwood. What they found was so horrifying, so methodical, that the government quickly sealed the records under federal secrecy laws, labeling them classified national security interest. To this day, many of those files remain restricted. But through leaked documents, faded journals, and testimony from those who dared to speak out, the story has clawed its way back into the light. And the heart of that story beats inside the walls of the Church of the Pure Spirit, founded by 3 enigmatic brothers who arrived in Ravenwood in 1825, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. What they preached was no ordinary gospel. It was a doctrine forged in shadows and blood, declaring that only through suffering can the soul be purified, and that pain was not a curse, but a divine sacrament. Their church was no humble wooden chapel, built of dark stone quarried from the surrounding hills. It towered over the pines with a steeple that seemed almost absurdly tall for a congregation of a few hundred. There were no windows in the main sanctuary, only lanterns carefully placed to cast shifting shadows across the octagonal chamber. It was a place designed not merely for worship but for secrecy. Locals would later recall that even in broad daylight, the church seemed to exude a kind of quiet malevolence. Birds avoided its steeple. Animals refused to graze too close to its foundation. And on certain nights, some swore they could hear the faint echo of screams carried on the breeze, though no one dared investigate too closely. There are places in America where history doesn't just linger, it festers. And Ravenwood, New York, is one of those places. The soil there has soaked up secrets that refuse to stay buried. And the story of the Church of the Pure Spirit is one of the most chilling entries in the annals of America's hidden horrors. If you're drawn to true crime cults, hidden American history, secret rituals, and the dark underbelly of faith turned fanatic, stay with us. Because what happened in Ravenwood was more than murder. It was the construction of a perfect machine for evil, hidden in plain sight. In America, we like to believe that evil announces itself loudly with flashing lights, with chaos, with monsters we can see. But sometimes, evil wears the calm smile of salvation and builds its home in the shadows where no one thinks to look. Long before the Civil War tore the nation in two, a quiet town named Ravenwood, nestled about 40 miles north of Albany, seemed like just another speck on the map. Its people farmed the dense forests, traded timber, and lived in peace among rolling hills. Yet hidden beneath that tranquility, something began to stir in the year 1825, a darkness so profound that even today, historians and true crime researchers argue over how it could have taken root so deeply, so silently. The arrival of the Ravencroft brothers should have been unremarkable. Men passed through towns like Ravenwood all the time, selling new gospels, pitching new visions of salvation. But these three carried with them not merely scripture but an agenda woven from pain, power, and a chilling promise of purity through agony. Elder Ezra, tall and solemn, spoke with a voice like thunder, mesmerizing those who listened. Deacon Silas, bespectacled and scholarly, scribbled ceaselessly into leather-bound books, crafting a theology none could fully decipher. And then there was Prophet Caleb, pale-eyed and soft-spoken, whose whispers seemed to float through the rafters, unsettling even the most hardened men. They came with money, buying a large tract of forest land. They built a church not of white clapboard like every other meeting house in upstate New York, but of dark, glistening stone cut from the surrounding hills. The locals were curious, perhaps even impressed, at first. But curiosity began to rot into suspicion. Inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, no windows allowed the sun to pierce the gloom. Lanterns burned day and night, their flickering glow casting shifting patterns that seemed to twist across the stone walls. The main sanctuary, built in an octagonal shape, felt disorienting, like stepping into some cosmic puzzle designed to warp one's perception of space and time. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," Elder Ezra announced during their first public gathering. "In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation." The townspeople listened politely, as Americans often do when confronted with new preachers. But some left that first meeting shivering, unable to shake the feeling that they'd glimpsed something more sinister than just religious fervor. It was as if Ravenwood, in that moment, took its first step into a labyrinth from which it would never truly escape. The Ravencroft brothers timed their arrival with chilling perfection. The region had earned the name the Burned-Over District, scorched again and again by religious revivals that left communities raw and searching. Methodists, Baptists, Millerites all ignited movements promising heaven, salvation, or even the end of days. Yet the doctrine of the Ravencrofts went further. They promised not just forgiveness, but transformation. And they demanded a price that few could have imagined. At first, they spoke of spiritual refinement, quoting scripture about gold purified by fire, or Christ's suffering as the path to redemption. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the message shifted. "The flesh is the vessel of sin," Deacon Silas declared, standing before his growing flock, ink-stained fingers raised like a prophet. Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, broken. Only when the body is emptied can the spirit truly soar. It was a message that crawled under the skin. Because while many in Ravenwood recoiled, others felt the lure of absolution so powerful that they were willing to surrender not just their sins, but their bodies, their wills, and eventually, their lives. This wasn't just a cult, one historian later wrote. This was a machine built to convert faith into suffering and suffering into power. And as winter deepened in 1825, the people of Ravenwood found themselves caught in the gravity of the Ravencroft brothers, drawn toward a darkness that would eventually consume hundreds and leave behind a legacy of ritual horror that still echoes through America's hidden history. Because in the end, the greatest horrors don't announce themselves with screams, they whisper. And in Ravenwood, those whispers were about to become a roar. They say the darkest places in America are not marked on any map. They exist in the shadows between forgotten history and forbidden faith, and Ravenwood was about to become one of them. By the dawn of 1826, the Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer just a curiosity whispered about over fence posts or in the pews of more traditional churches. Word spread quickly through the nearby settlements that something unusual was happening in Ravenwood, a place that, until then, had been little more than a quiet stop between Albany and the wilderness beyond. Locals began noticing that the people attending the Ravencroft brothers' gatherings were changing. Some seemed lighter, as if unburdened by sins they no longer carried. Others seemed hollow-eyed, consumed by silent terrors they refused to name. It was said that Elder Ezra could look into your soul and see the secrets you kept buried. And those who spoke with Prophet Caleb came away trembling, certain they'd glimpsed a vision of something holy, or perhaps something monstrous. The brothers began to hold meetings late into the night, lanterns flickering in the church windows, though no one could see what took place inside. Chanting drifted into the forest, soft at first, then rising to feverish cries that chilled even the most practical farmers who passed by on moonlit roads. Rumors began to grow like weeds, whispers of rituals involving water and fire, of bodies trembling on cold stone floors, of purification through suffering. Yet every Sunday morning, the Ravencrofts appeared in town, calm and polite, shaking hands and speaking of salvation, their coats brushed clean of dust. This duality was the church's genius and its camouflage. Because to outsiders, Ravenwood seemed blessed by prosperity. New houses were going up, shops were busy. There was talk of building a school. But underneath the surface, a new social hierarchy was forming. Those who joined the Church of the Pure Spirit gained influence, favor, and the brothers' personal attention. Those who questioned too loudly found themselves quietly ostracized or simply vanished. It's easy to look back and wonder how people could fall for such madness, wrote historian Dr. William Garrett, who would later investigate the church's horrors. But Ravenwood wasn't full of fools. It was full of people desperate for hope and willing to ignore the smell of smoke if it meant their own sins might be forgiven. Among the earliest to be swept into the Ravencroft's orbit were people like Margaret Wilkins, a widow who'd lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever the previous winter. Broken with grief, she'd been contemplating ending her own life when she encountered Elder Ezra in town. He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts. She later wrote in a journal discovered by federal investigators decades later. He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair. That was the hook, the promise that pain itself held sacred meaning. And for many in Ravenwood, suffering wasn't hard to come by. Crops failed, families succumbed to illness, and harsh winters froze rivers solid and cut communities off for weeks. In such conditions, a preacher who claimed to transform suffering into salvation was more than persuasive. He was salvation itself. The Ravencrofts understood that desperate people would grasp at any chance for redemption, and they were more than willing to sell it for a price. They offered hope, said historian Lydia Thompson, but their hope came wrapped in chains. And so, Ravenwood began its quiet slide into darkness. A darkness that would eventually swallow hundreds of lives and leave behind one of America's most terrifying hidden cults. A secret history that even today refuses to stay buried. Because in Ravenwood, salvation and damnation were separated only by a locked church door and the echo of screams from somewhere deep below the earth. In Ravenwood, salvation didn't come on angel wings. It came wrapped in shadows, and it demanded blood. By the close of 1826, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown from a curiosity to a force that defined life in Ravenwood. Families who once filled the pews of the old Presbyterian church drifted away, drawn to the hypnotic sermons of Elder Ezra, who spoke of tribulation as the gateway to true redemption. Neighbors who used to share crops and news began speaking in hushed tones, suspicious of who might be watching for the Ravencrofts. It was as though an invisible fog had settled over the town, clouding friendships, severing trust, and weaving every conversation with caution. The Ravencroft brothers had perfected the art of gradual corruption. At first, the rituals they introduced were striking but not entirely alien. Extended fasting was already a practice among some revivalist groups. Night-long prayer vigils, cold water baptisms, even public confession of sins, all these had roots in American religious movements. But beneath the surface, the brothers were engineering a slow acclimatization to pain and submission. People began to accept stranger rules. Congregants were urged to sleep on hard wooden floors as a test of faith. Couples were separated for weeks to purge carnal temptation. Meals were rationed to humble the flesh. And always there were the whispers of something more profound, waiting beyond suffering, a higher plane. A pure spirit. The chance to be elevated. It wasn't enough for the Ravencrofts to command obedience. They needed to build believers who would sacrifice everything. Even their own flesh, said historian Dr. Lydia Thompson, whose research into American religious cults remains a gold standard in the field. One detail that struck many observers was how the brothers tailored their message to each individual's deepest fears or guilt. Elder Ezra had a knack for pinpointing emotional wounds and pressing on them like bruises. Prophet Caleb's soft, eerie voice could transform even the harshest doctrine into a whisper of salvation. Deacon Silas, ever scholarly, quoted scripture and medical texts in equal measure, creating an intellectual framework that made the madness seem logical. People like Margaret Wilkins, whose journal would later become crucial evidence, described feeling seen and understood in a way no traditional preacher had ever managed. He said my suffering had purpose. She wrote of Elder Ezra, that every tear I shed was washing sin away. I wanted to believe him because the alternative was that my pain meant nothing at all. That was the genius and the horror of the Church of the Pure Spirit. They didn't just exploit fear. They exploited grief, guilt, and the human need to make sense of suffering. And slowly, they began to separate their followers from the world beyond Ravenwood. By late 1826, new members were required to undergo discernment interviews, private sessions with Prophet Caleb to determine if they were suitable vessels for purification. Those judged unworthy were gently encouraged to leave Ravenwood or simply vanished. Those deemed worthy were ushered deeper into the inner circle, drawn into secrets that outsiders could not fathom. From that point forward, life in Ravenwood was divided by an invisible line: those who were part of the Church of the Pure Spirit, and those who were not. The town's economy began to orbit around the church. Businesses run by members prospered. Skeptics found themselves excluded from community dealings, forced to watch as their neighbors fell under the brothers' spell. Ravenwood was no longer a town, wrote Dr. Garrett. It had become a testing ground for how far faith could be twisted before it broke. And as 1827 approached, the Ravencroft brothers stood at the threshold of transforming their church from an eccentric sect into something far more sinister. Because for them, belief was just the beginning. The real goal was to see how much pain a human soul could endure in the name of salvation. What if the place you called home, the neighbors you trusted, and the faith you held sacred all turned out to be nothing but the camouflage for a nightmare so vast it rewrote the meaning of salvation itself? By the early months of 1827, the presence of the Ravencroft brothers in Ravenwood was no longer just an oddity. It was becoming the gravitational force around which the entire town seemed to revolve. People who once gathered in the town square for simple trading days now drifted toward the imposing dark stone walls of the Church of the Pure Spirit, drawn by curiosity, fear, or something they couldn't quite name. It was here that the townsfolk of Ravenwood would have their first true contact with a doctrine that blurred the boundaries between faith and fanaticism and forced them to question the very fabric of their reality. At first glance, the Ravencroft brothers presented themselves as pillars of hope in an era weighed down by uncertainty. America, in the 1820s, was a nation in flux, a place where the fires of religious revival, economic ambition, and territorial expansion burned brightly, often overlapping in chaotic ways. People craved answers. They longed for certainty in a world spinning faster every year, and the brothers delivered precisely that. They spoke in poetic verses, peppering sermons with scripture and tales of divine visions. Elder Ezra commanded the pulpit, with a voice that rumbled through the sanctuary like distant thunder. Deacon Silas wove theology and science into a seamless tapestry, quoting not only the Bible but medical journals and ancient texts. And Prophet Caleb, ever the enigma, spoke in whispers that seemed to echo off the church's stone walls even when he barely moved his lips. "We have not come to steal your faith," Elder Ezra proclaimed. "We have come to show you what lies beyond the veil, a truth too bright for the timid, too powerful for the faint of heart." It was this blend of charisma and mystery that made the first true contact with the church so potent. People arrived curious, but left haunted, carrying home pieces of sermons that rattled around in their minds long after the lanterns in the sanctuary had been snuffed out. The Ravenkrafts didn't simply preach, they implanted questions that gnawed at the soul. Was suffering really punishment? Or was it the road to purity? Was pain a curse, or a divine gift? This is how cults are born, not with chains and threats, but with a single question whispered into the darkness. What if everything you believe is a lie? The first contact sessions inside the Church of the Pure Spirit were designed to erode certainty. Attendees were seated in the octagonal sanctuary, surrounded by stone walls that seemed to close and the longer one sat there. Lanterns flickered, casting shadows that moved like living things. In those moments, Prophet Caleb would often step forward, speaking of visions in which angels screamed in agony, and the gates of heaven were barred to all but the most purified souls. It was during these gatherings that the idea of purification through tribulation was first seeded into Ravenwood's consciousness. The brothers spoke of trials by water, by fire, by deprivation, all designed not to punish, but to elevate, to cleanse the vessel so that the spirit might shine. Deacon Silas would say, his eyes gleaming behind wire-rimmed spectacles. But even as townspeople nodded, many left with chills they could not explain. They found themselves lying awake at night, replaying the brothers' words, struggling to reconcile what they'd heard with the world they thought they knew. The real terror wasn't that the brothers were preaching heresy. The real terror was that, deep down, some part of every person in that room suspected they might be right, because in Ravenwood, doubt was the first step into darkness. And the Ravencroft brothers were masters at planting that doubt and nurturing it until it consumed everything else. What if salvation wasn't a promise but a trap? What if the people you trusted most were architects of your suffering? As 1827 progressed, the Ravencroft brothers unveiled the next layer of their influence. Private gatherings they called discernment interviews. On the surface, these sessions appeared harmless, simply conversations to determine a person's spiritual readiness. But inside the dimly lit chambers of the Church of the Pure Spirit, these interviews became something far more insidious, a tool to probe, manipulate, and ultimately rewrite the reality of those who dared to sit before the brothers. Witnesses who later escaped Ravenwood described how the brothers each played distinct roles during these encounters. Elder Ezra loomed large, his presence commanding, his deep-set eyes scanning every twitch of the nervous faithful who sat before him. Deacon Silas would sit beside a massive ledger, quill scratching across the page as he recorded personal confessions, family secrets, private fears. And then there was Prophet Caleb, moving quietly around the room, whispering words that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and go straight into the mind. He spoke as if God himself was using his tongue, recalled Thomas Hartford, who barely survived his time in the church. You'd confess things you didn't even know you believed, and once you said it out loud, it felt like there was no going back. It was in these intimate sessions that the Ravenkrafts refined their psychological hold. They asked questions about past trauma, about guilt and shame, about the silent sins people carried in the dark corners of their souls. They didn't just seek followers, they sought vulnerabilities, and once they found them, they exploited them without mercy. Locals who had once been solid, practical frontier people began to change. Friends noticed distant looks in their eyes. Families whispered that their loved ones were becoming hollow, as if some part of them had been scooped out and replaced with a chilling serenity. People began donating land, livestock, and even entire savings to the church. One farmer reportedly deeded over 50 acres of fertile land, convinced that worldly attachments prevent spiritual elevation. That's how they made Ravenwood theirs, explained historian Dr. Lydia Thompson. They didn't just take the town physically, they took it psychologically, one person at a time. Yet the most terrifying aspect of these first real contacts was that the brothers didn't rely on overt threats or violence. They wielded suggestion like a scalpel, slicing away people's doubts until the only reality left was the one crafted inside the dark walls of the church. Prophet Caleb was particularly skilled at weaving visions of cosmic consequence into his whispers. He would describe celestial beings in agony, burning skies, and rivers of blood washing away humanity's sins. But woven between these horrifying images was the gentle reassurance that the pain is holy. The pain is the proof. People would leave these interviews trembling, sometimes weeping, convinced they had glimpsed a secret truth. And that's how the real power of the Church of the Pure Spirit began to take root, not as a faith people chose freely, but as an infection that rewrote what they thought was possible, what they thought was moral, even what they believed about themselves. Because once you start to believe that agony can be sacred, the line between salvation and damnation begins to disappear. Reality isn't just what we see, Elder Ezra once proclaimed to a hushed audience. Reality is what the Spirit reveals to those who have the courage to suffer for the truth. And in Ravenwood, courage and suffering were about to become indistinguishable. What if the walls of a church could hold not salvation, but secrets so monstrous that they warp reality itself? As 1827 progressed into the harsher seasons, the Church of the Pure Spirit continued its slow but relentless infiltration into the veins of Ravenwood. By now, it wasn't only the sermons or the discernment interviews that held people spellbound. It was the eerie sense that the very laws of reality bent inside those dark stone walls. The deeper people ventured into the church, the more they felt as though they were stepping into another world, a place where pain was a sacrament and suffering was a ladder to divine enlightenment. One of the most disturbing aspects of these first true contacts was the Ravencroft brothers' growing use of symbolism and architectural manipulation to disorient and hypnotize their followers. The octagonal sanctuary, so unusual for New York churches of that era, created acoustics that caused even a whisper to echo and swirl like ghostly voices. Lanterns were strategically placed to cast shadows that appeared to move of their own accord, dancing along the dark stone walls. Even the floorboards creaked in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. It was like the building itself was alive, said Thomas Hartford, who would later escape the cult. You'd think you saw figures in the corners, moving just outside the light, and you'd wonder, was it your imagination? Or were you really being watched? Prophet Caleb took full advantage of these unsettling effects. He'd often stand motionless for minutes, letting the silence stretch so taut that people felt ready to scream. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he'd speak of visions so vivid and terrifying that listeners felt transported. He described the sky splitting open to reveal a realm of blazing light, filled with angels screaming in agony as their wings burned to cinders. He told of rivers turning black, and cities collapsing into pits of fire, all punishments for those unwilling to embrace the trials of suffering. But he also offered hope, twisted though it was. Only through pain can the spirit shed its corruption, Caleb would murmur, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Only those who endure shall ascend. It was this constant swing between terror and reassurance that burrowed deep into the minds of Ravenwood's people. They were shown visions of damnation so horrific that even the harshest winter storms seemed mild in comparison, and then given a single escape, surrendering themselves completely to the Ravencrofts. And here's where the line between reality and hallucination began to blur irrevocably. Those who spent long hours in the church began reporting strange physical sensations, the feeling of heat radiating from stone walls, the taste of iron on their tongues, sudden waves of nausea or euphoria that seemed to come from nowhere. Some claimed they saw light pouring out from the cracks in the floorboards, or heard muffled screams rising from beneath the sanctuary. They didn't just prey on faith, said Dr. Lydia Thompson. They rewired reality itself. People began doubting their own senses. And once you can't trust what your eyes see or your ears hear, you belong entirely to whoever tells you what's true. Farmers, who once prided themselves on being practical and skeptical, now confessed to seeing angels floating in the rafters. Mothers spoke of hearing their dead children whispering from the walls, urging them to submit to purification. And slowly, the town's identity unraveled, replaced by a single, pulsating truth: suffering was salvation, and salvation belonged to the Ravencrofts. Because in Ravenwood, the greatest horror was not that monsters might come from outside, it was the realization that the monsters were already inside, hiding behind the facade of holy men, and rewriting reality one soul at a time. There are moments when history feels like fiction, until you realize the nightmare was real all along. As 1827 slid deeper into bitter winter, the facade of normalcy in Ravenwood was cracking. What began as fascination with the Ravencroft brothers had now mutated into something more potent and infinitely more dangerous. Those who once scoffed at tales of cults and hidden horrors found themselves second-guessing everything they knew about faith, reality, and the limits of human cruelty. The brothers were no longer just preachers. They had become architects of a new reality. And the townspeople were living inside the blueprints, inside the Church of the Pure Spirit. The sermons had shifted tone. The brothers spoke less of salvation and more about the necessity of suffering, how agony was not only a test, but a doorway. Pain reveals truth. Elder Ezra thundered during one gathering, his voice reverberating off the cold stone walls. Only when flesh is broken can the spirit glimpse the divine. This was no metaphor. And it was in this phase of contact that the brothers began introducing the early rituals that would later escalate into full-blown torture. Witnesses recounted the trial of water, in which followers were held underwater for brief intervals, told to imagine their sins washing away as the world blurred into darkness. Though most were revived, some were left gasping, coughing up blood, eyes wide with terror. Yet afterward, many participants reported feeling strangely euphoric, as if they'd survived death itself and emerged reborn. That was the dangerous genius of the Ravencrofts. They wrapped trauma in a language of transcendence, convincing people that their suffering meant something profound. Margaret Wilkins, the grieving widow drawn to the church by promises of purpose, described her first experience with the rituals in a journal later seized by federal investigators. I felt the icy water enter my nose, my mouth, my body thrashed. But I heard Elder Ezra's voice saying, "Breathe in the spirit." When they pulled me out, I collapsed. And yet there was a moment, before I fainted, when I felt lighter than air. Outside the church, rumors spread like wildfire. Townsfolk whispered of bruises glimpsed beneath the collars of the faithful, of screams heard at odd hours drifting over the snow-covered hills. Yet when confronted, church members simply smiled and murmured phrases like, "Through suffering comes purity, through purity comes elevation." It was during this time that the Ravencroft brothers began isolating their followers more aggressively. Families were encouraged to move into simple wooden dwellings clustered around the church grounds. Community events were either canceled or quietly absorbed into church activities. People who refused to join found themselves increasingly cut off from commerce, gossip, and the lifeblood of small-town existence. But the most insidious change was invisible, the slow corrosion of reality itself. The faithful spoke of waking visions of angels with wings flayed open, of cities drowned in blood. They began to see patterns in the lantern light that spelled messages only they could read. Prophet Caleb reinforced these delusions, claiming these were glimpses of the divine anatomy, secret knowledge granted only to those willing to suffer for the truth. That was their true power, explained Dr. Lydia Thompson, a historian of American religious movements. They made people doubt not just the outside world, but their own senses. And once you doubt your senses, you belong completely to whoever tells you what's real. By the end of 1827, Ravenwood was no longer merely a town. It had become a stage upon which the Ravencrofts rehearsed their dark theology, transforming ordinary people into willing vessels for ritual torment. And as the snow fell silently over the hills, a deeper silence settled over Ravenwood, the silence of a town beginning to question whether the monsters they feared were ever outside their walls or already hiding inside the church's shadowy halls. In Ravenwood, the first casualty wasn't the body, it was reality itself. By early 1828, the Ravencroft brothers' influence had seeped so deeply into the roots of Ravenwood that the town itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the dark stone church. What had started as curiosity had become fervor, and what had seemed eccentric had transformed into an ideology so total that even the laws of nature seemed to bend around it. People who'd never given a thought to theology now spoke in cryptic phrases, quoting Elder Ezra as though he were scripture. Farmers discussed the weight of sin the way they once spoke of weather patterns or the price of timber. Women who once gathered to quilt and gossip now met in secrecy, whispering of visions and divine tests. And through it all, the Ravencroft brothers continued crafting an entirely new reality, one where pain was virtue, and the line between life and death blurred into ritual. It was around this time that the brothers introduced what they called the vessel doctrine, This was a revelation that sent shockwaves through the congregation. According to Deacon Silas, the human body was merely a temporary shell, a container designed to hold the spirit only until it could be purified. True believers were told that through ritual suffering, they could become vessels of the pure spirit, conduits between the divine and mortal realms. And if necessary, those vessels could be emptied violently to make way for the spirit's next inhabitant. Once they accepted that idea, the brothers could justify anything, said Dr. Lydia Thompson. Murder wasn't murder anymore. It was purification. Torture wasn't cruelty. It was a sacred test. This radical theology was first introduced during a series of sermons in the winter of 1828, delivered amid freezing temperatures that left frost crusting the church walls. Elder Ezra would stand before his flock, his breath fogging in the cold sanctuary, declaring, "The flesh is the cage. The spirit is the prisoner. Shall we not break the bars and set it free?" But it wasn't only words. The brothers orchestrated staged healings and exorcisms to demonstrate their supposed power over life and death. Witnesses claimed that Prophet Caleb would lay hands on followers who fell into violent fits, only for them to rise moments later, shaking and sobbing with joy. It was impossible for most townsfolk to separate what was genuine from what was performed, and that was precisely the point. The Ravencrofts were erasing the line between miracle and manipulation. In the depths of winter, the church began to hold all-night vigils where the air inside grew heavy with incense and the chanting of dozens of voices. Those who stayed until dawn often emerged glassy-eyed, mumbling about visions of angels screaming in celestial agony, rivers of blood, and cities consumed in divine fire. Some fainted during these gatherings, others wept uncontrollably, and a few most disturbingly begged to be allowed to suffer more, convinced it would bring them closer to God. Outside the sanctuary, life in Ravenwood began to fracture. Businesses run by church members thrived, while those who refused to join the church saw trade dry up. Old alliances collapsed, families turned on each other. People who had lived side by side for decades suddenly viewed each other as either enlightened vessels or dangerous unbelievers. The Ravencrofts had done more than build a church. They'd constructed an invisible wall, cutting Ravenwood off from the rest of the world. This wasn't just a cult, it was an alternate reality, said Dr. Garrett, who spent years researching the case. And the terrifying part was that for many, it was preferable to the real world. And so, by 1828, Ravenwood stood at the brink of a precipice. The town's soul had been captured, not by brute force, but by the careful manipulation of fear, hope, and the human need to believe that even the worst suffering must hold some divine purpose. In Ravenwood, the truth was no longer what you saw with your eyes. It was whatever the Ravencroft brothers whispered into your trembling ears. In Ravenwood, the walls didn't just keep secrets in, they kept the world out. And by the winter of 1829, the town had become a fortress of fear, ruled by men who believed salvation demanded blood. By the close of the 1820s, Ravenwood was no longer just a town caught up in the spiritual fervor of the burned-over district. It had become a sealed realm, where reality bent to the will of the Ravencroft brothers. People who once greeted each other warmly in the dusty streets now avoided eye contact, afraid that even a careless word could mark them as disloyal. Neighbors disappeared overnight, their homes left eerily untouched as though waiting for ghosts to return. Inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, the rituals were escalating. The brothers, now confident in their power, began introducing new ceremonies so extreme that even their most devoted followers flinched. The brothers called these trials the 7 purifications. Each ritual targeted one of the senses or bodily vulnerabilities, designed to break the spirit so it could be filled with the pure spirit. Witnesses who later escaped described chilling scenes: congregants stripped to undergarments and bound to inverted crosses while icy water was poured over their faces. Heated metal pressed against flesh to leave patterns of burns, soil packed around victims' bodies until they could barely breathe. All the while, the congregation stood around them, chanting, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." It wasn't just torture, said historian Dr. Lydia Thompson. It was theater. Every scream was part of the liturgy. Every drop of blood was another step closer to what the Ravencrofts called the final ascension. But perhaps the most insidious weapon in the brothers' arsenal was not physical violence, it was psychological isolation. As the trials grew more extreme, the Ravencrofts encouraged their followers to sever all ties with outsiders. Husbands were told to avoid their wives for weeks to test chastity. Parents were instructed to rebuke their children if they questioned the doctrine. Letters from concerned relatives went unanswered. Commerce with neighboring towns slowed to a trickle. Ravenwood was becoming a psychological island, and those who tried to leave many simply vanished. Rumors spread that escapees were hunted down by loyal members of the church, dragged back in the dead of night. Others were rumored to have met their ends in the vast forests that surrounded Ravenwood, their bodies hidden beneath pine needles and snow. The message was clear. Once you enter the Church of the Pure Spirit, there is no leaving except through the trials or through death. As winter descended, the cold seemed to deepen the town's sense of imprisonment. Temperatures dropped below zero, and the church's dark stone walls frosted over until they gleamed like black ice beneath the pale sun. People huddled in their homes, terrified of what new revelation might come from the pulpit next. The psychological strain was immense. Margaret Wilkins, whose journal has become one of the most vivid surviving records of life under the Ravencrofts, wrote in late 1829, "It is as though we dwell in two worlds now. In one, there's the sky, the trees, the sound of birds. In the other, there is only darkness and the voice of the brothers, and I can no longer tell which is real." This was the moment the Ravencrofts had been waiting for, the moment when Ravenwood was sufficiently isolated, traumatized, and indoctrinated that they could begin the truly irreversible rituals. Because for the brothers, the church was not merely a house of worship, it was a laboratory, and the people of Ravenwood were their living specimens. And as December 1829 approached, the brothers prepared to unveil the event that would finally shatter the last fragile barrier between ritual and murder. The sheep are gathered. Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers in a private council. Now begins the true work of the shepherd. When the walls closed in on Ravenwood, the real prison wasn't stone, it was belief. By the last weeks of 1829, the Ravencroft brothers had transformed Ravenwood into a place where fear wasn't just an emotion, it was the law. What began as whispered rumors had solidified into a suffocating reality. The Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer merely a congregation, it was a regime. And in this regime, suffering wasn't an aberration, it was the currency of salvation. Inside the church's towering octagonal sanctuary, the 7 purifications had become routine, performed with a precision that blurred the line between religious ritual and medical procedure. Elder Ezra's voice thundered through the chamber, describing how each trial would strip away sin. But it wasn't only physical agony that gripped Ravenwood. It was the relentless psychological warfare waged by the brothers, a campaign so meticulous it left even the strongest minds frayed at the edges. The town's once tight-knit community fractured into factions, those wholly devoted to the Ravencrofts, and those silently praying to avoid notice. People began speaking in half-sentences, fearful of informants lurking in every pew and street corner. Children were taught to report parents who questioned the doctrine. Husbands turned on wives. Friends became strangers. No one trusted anyone anymore, wrote Thomas Hartford, who would later testify about the horrors he witnessed. It was as if the entire town had been infected with suspicion. And suspicion was precisely what the Ravencroft brothers wanted. In one sermon, Prophet Caleb declared, "The devil hides behind familiar faces. Even the ones you love most may be vessels of corruption." It was a statement that detonated like a bomb in Ravenwood. Overnight, decades-old friendships dissolved. The market square fell silent. People crossed the street rather than risk even a polite greeting. Outside the church, winter laid its icy claim over Ravenwood. Snow piled high, trapping families in their cabins for days at a time. The winds howled through the trees, carrying echoes of chanting from the church at all hours. Some swore they heard distant screams woven into the wind itself. And still, the church bells tolled, summoning the faithful for yet another night of trials. It was during this time that the Ravencroft brothers began to test their most loyal followers in cruel new ways. Prophet Caleb singled out members for spontaneous public confessions, forcing them to reveal hidden sins before the entire congregation. Deacon Silas introduced exercises in voluntary endurance, where followers were ordered to stand motionless for hours in the freezing sanctuary, reciting verses about the purifying nature of pain. Elder Ezra demanded increasing tithes, property, livestock, even children's futures to prove total devotion. And it worked. Because in the twisted logic of the Ravencrofts, the more a person sacrificed, the more invested they became in believing the suffering was worth it. That's how they trapped us. Margaret Wilkins wrote in her journal. They took our tears and turned them into chains. If we admitted it was all madness, then every wound, every death, would have been for nothing. Some tried to resist, but resistance came at a price. One man, Robert Simmons, attempted to flee with his wife and 2 children in the dead of night. They were found days later, huddled in a frozen ravine, all dead from exposure. Elder Ezra mourned them publicly, but then warned the congregation that those who abandon the path of purification will find only darkness. By the end of 1829, the church had become an inescapable vortex. For the people of Ravenwood, the outside world no longer existed. There was only the voice of Elder Ezra, the quiet scribbling of Deacon Silas's quill, and the hypnotic whispers of Prophet Caleb. And as the new year approached, one chilling question loomed over every soul in Ravenwood. How much suffering was enough to buy salvation? In Ravenwood, salvation wore the mask of suffering, and behind that mask, a darkness waited, hungry for blood. As winter 1829 crept toward its end, the Ravencroft brothers sensed that Ravenwood was sufficiently broken and reshaped to endure the next level of their monstrous vision. And so began the construction of what would become the church's most horrifying secret, the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. At first, the townspeople saw nothing amiss in the steady arrival of carts hauling timber and stone to the church grounds. Elder Ezra explained that the church needed cellars for storage, a place to keep supplies for harsh winters. Yet as the weeks passed, those cellars expanded into tunnels, and the laborers doing the digging were no longer outsiders hired from neighboring towns. They were members of the church itself, loyal followers sworn to secrecy under the penalty of eternal damnation. Margaret Wilkins later recorded in her journal the strange sense of foreboding that fell over the community during those months. Every time I passed the church, I felt as though the ground itself was groaning, she wrote, as if something alive lay beneath, clawing toward the surface. The catacombs quickly became more than just storage. Prophet Caleb claimed he'd received visions commanding the creation of underground chambers of purification. These rooms, he declared, would serve as holy places where the most devoted believers could undergo rituals away from prying eyes. But in reality, the catacombs were a maze of darkness and terror, designed for one purpose: to break human beings utterly. Testimonies from survivors describe narrow corridors winding through blackness, lit only by lanterns whose flames flickered in stale air. Walls were lined with hooks and iron rings set into the stone. Rooms were labeled with names like the Chamber of Trials and the Chamber of Ascension. In the center of this subterranean labyrinth lay the most chilling room of all, the Chamber of Saints. It wasn't saints they kept down there, said Dr. Lydia Thompson, historian and cult researcher. It was the remains of their victims preserved, posed, and displayed like trophies of faith gone mad. By this stage, the rituals had evolved into full-scale torture, disguised as divine tests. The brothers no longer confined themselves to symbolic acts like fasting or cold water immersions. Instead, the catacombs became theaters of unspeakable violence. Followers were subjected to prolonged isolation in pitch blackness. Some were forced to kneel on salt-covered stone floors for hours while reciting prayers until their legs bled. Others were bound and exposed to near-freezing temperatures, left to shiver until they hallucinated visions that the brothers declared proof of divine contact. Prophet Caleb, increasingly consumed by visions and fits of religious ecstasy, claimed that the spirit grows louder underground, where the earth's blood sings to us. His sermons took on a manic edge, and many reported that during rituals in the catacombs, he would speak in languages no one understood, his eyes rolling back into his skull as he convulsed violently. Yet the most terrifying aspect of this escalation was not merely physical pain. It was the profound psychological rupture it inflicted. Victims emerged from the catacombs barely human, staring blankly, speaking in hushed tones, their identities eroded by the relentless doctrine that agony was holy. Families barely recognized loved ones who returned. And worst of all, some followers began to beg to go back, convinced that further suffering would grant them ultimate salvation. Outside the church, the town of Ravenwood felt the growing pulse of evil rising from beneath their feet. People heard muffled wails at night. The ground occasionally vibrated, as if from distant hammering. Snowdrifts seemed to settle in strange patterns, swirling over hidden tunnels. Yet few dared to question. Because by now, To question was to invite suspicion, and suspicion was a sentence worse than death. By the end of 1829, Ravenwood was no longer part of America, said Dr. Garrett. It was a kingdom unto itself, ruled by 3 men who believed God wanted blood and who were willing to tear reality apart to get it. It's one thing to lose your freedom. It's another to lose the truth itself. By the dawn of 1830, the people of Ravenwood were living in a perpetual state of siege, not by an army, nor by a foreign power, but by the terrifying certainty that reality itself was under the dominion of the Ravencroft brothers. On the surface, life staggered along. The timber wagons still rolled through the snowy roads. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children played in the snow, though their laughter seemed hollow and strained. But underneath that veneer, the fabric of Ravenwood's world was unraveling. The brothers had perfected a system where belief wasn't merely preached, it was enforced, sculpted, and imposed until even the strongest minds began to fracture. One of the brothers' most insidious tactics was the calculated use of public confession. Prophet Caleb, often pale and trembling as if gripped by visions, would suddenly call out names during sermons, singling out members of the congregation for what he called the cleansing of hidden darkness. People were dragged before the church to admit sins that ranged from petty lies to doubts about the Ravencroft doctrine. The spectacle was horrific, grown men sobbing, women shaking uncontrollably, children staring wide-eyed as parents confessed to secret doubts or imaginary betrayals. And each confession ended with a ritual punishment: lashes across the back, hours of kneeling on salt-strewn stone, or forced isolation in the pitch-black catacombs. Confession wasn't about forgiveness, said Dr. Lydia Thompson, historian of American religious cults. It was about total domination. They turned guilt into a weapon. Yet even worse was the way these confessions destroyed the bonds between families and friends. Husbands and wives began sleeping in separate quarters, suspicious of each other's loyalty. Children were conditioned to listen for signs of doubt in their parents' conversations. A careless word could doom an entire household. During this period, Elder Ezra's sermons took on a distinctly apocalyptic tone. He warned that the world outside Ravenwood had fallen into sin beyond redemption, that only those willing to endure the brothers' trials would be saved. The soil of America is stained, he proclaimed. Only through blood and fire can it be cleansed. These fiery declarations sparked a new wave of paranoia. Any contact with outsiders, traders, travelers, distant relatives was viewed as dangerous contamination. The church began tracking who spoke to whom, who visited neighboring towns, who hesitated when asked to recite the church's doctrine. The brothers also exploited ritual repetition to cement their control. The same phrases echoed night after night. Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation. The same hymns played over and over. The same violent imagery was repeated until the townspeople's nightmares became indistinguishable from reality. They were hacking the human brain, said Dr. Garrett, an expert on religious extremism. Repetition is one of the most powerful tools of mind control ever devised. Meanwhile, the catacombs grew deeper, more elaborate. The Ravencroft brothers reportedly began preserving the bodies of those who died during rituals. Displaying them in twisted tableaux meant to inspire devotion and fear. Some corpses were posed as if praying. Others were arranged to appear in states of ecstatic agony. Witnesses who managed to escape described entering the chamber of saints and feeling as though the dead were watching them, silently urging them to surrender to the same fate. Outside the church walls, the townsfolk existed in a liminal space, not truly alive, yet not allowed to die. They were caught in a machine of terror, unsure whether to cling to the fragments of their old lives or submit fully to the new reality dictated by the brothers. Because by now, in Ravenwood, truth was no longer determined by fact, it was dictated by 3 men who believed they spoke for God. And the price of doubting them was measured in blood. Some truths don't just shatter the mind, they annihilate the very idea of reality. On the night of December 21st, 1829, the longest night of the year, the people of Ravenwood were summoned into the sanctuary of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Lanterns flickered along the walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to stretch into monstrous shapes. The room smelled of burning oil and cold stone, and an unnatural silence gripped the crowd as Elder Ezra stepped forward. "Tonight," he announced, his voice resonant and calm, "the veil shall be lifted. You shall see the path to true purification, and the price it demands." From the back of the sanctuary, Prophet Caleb emerged, led forward by Deacon Silas. Caleb's appearance sent a ripple of horror through the gathered followers. His skin was nearly translucent, stretched tight over protruding bones, and his eyes rolled wildly in his head as he mumbled in a language no one understood. He looked like something torn from a nightmare, recalled Thomas Hartford, who would later testify to the horrors of that night. Caleb collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently. The congregation gasped, but Elder Ezra raised his hand for silence. He claimed that Caleb was receiving visions directly from the pure spirit. When Caleb finally rose again, he spoke in a calm, eerie voice. "The Spirit has chosen 3 among you for the first ascension. They shall bear the pain of the world and become gateways to salvation." The chosen were Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters, each of them relatively new converts, each visibly terrified as Deacon Silas led them to the center of the sanctuary, where a massive spiral pattern had been carved into the floorboards, winding inward toward a raised wooden platform. Here, the true horror unfolded. In front of nearly 150 witnesses, the Ravencroft brothers stripped the chosen to their undergarments despite the bitter cold. They were bound to wooden frames shaped like inverted crosses. Elder Ezra addressed the congregation, declaring that inversion was not blasphemy but a sacred reversal, from pride to humility, from comfort to agony, from life to death to rebirth. Then began what the brothers called the 7 trials of purification. Wet cloths soaked in freezing water were pressed over the victims' faces, simulating drowning. Earth was packed around their bodies until only their heads protruded, gasping for air. Heated metal seared symbols into their skin. They were plunged repeatedly into barrels of ice-cold water, revived only to face the next torment. The witnesses described the victims trembling, vomiting, eyes rolling back as they screamed for mercy. But the worst was the response of the congregation. Many wept, but others stared in rapture, whispering the same mantra over and over: through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation. "That's when I knew," Thomas Hartford later said, voice trembling in court, "that we'd gone somewhere no human beings were ever meant to go. And there was no way back." As dawn approached, the 3 victims were left limp, barely conscious, hanging from their restraints. Elder Ezra stepped forward, lifting his hands as though conducting a sacred rite. Prophet Caleb, now eerily calm, approached each victim and whispered into their ears. Witnesses claimed the victims began to convulse violently, their bodies straining against the wooden frames until bones audibly cracked. Their eyes flew open, bloodshot and bulging, as they began speaking in the same guttural, alien tongue Caleb had used earlier. Moments later, all 3 fell silent and lifeless. Elder Ezra proclaimed, "They have ascended. They stand now before the pure spirit, cleansed of all sin." But rather than burying the bodies, the brothers carried them into the catacombs beneath the church, declaring them holy relics to be revered. And in that instant, Ravenwood crossed a threshold from twisted faith into the realm of unspeakable evil. Because from that night on, murder was no longer hidden in the shadows, it had become a sacrament. There's a place where faith stops being faith and becomes something far darker, a weapon to annihilate the human mind. In the aftermath of the First Ascension, Ravenwood plunged into an abyss deeper than anyone outside the church walls could have imagined. Because that single night, soaked in blood and holy chants, had rewired reality itself. From that point on, murder wasn't simply a byproduct of fanaticism, it was doctrine. And the people of Ravenwood were trapped inside a nightmare, where suffering was worshipped and doubt was the ultimate sin. Elder Ezra wasted no time seizing upon the stunned silence that followed the ritual killings. "What you witnessed," he told the congregation, "was proof that the pure spirit speaks through agony. The spirit demanded blood, and our brothers and sisters delivered their gift. Their reward is eternity." Almost immediately, the Ravencroft brothers began introducing new theological concepts designed to crush any lingering resistance. Among these was the notion of the empty vessel. According to Deacon Silas, a human being could be purged so completely through suffering that their body became a pure container, ready to host the divine essence. This was how they justified the killings, said Dr. Lydia Thompson. They were no longer murders, they were acts of spiritual alchemy. The psychological impact was devastating. Members who'd witnessed the First Ascension now carried 2 irreconcilable truths: what they'd seen was monstrous, and yet they were told it was holy. The dissonance broke people's minds. Some fell into catatonic silence, others became fervent believers, determined to prove their loyalty by enduring even worse torments. "Either you surrendered completely," wrote Margaret Wilkins, "or you risked being chosen next." Meanwhile, the catacombs grew even more elaborate. The brothers instructed their inner circle to transform the underground labyrinth into a sacred necropolis. Bodies of those deemed to have ascended were preserved with techniques Deacon Silas reportedly borrowed from medical texts and European mortuary science. Corpses were posed in grotesque tableaus, hands clasped in eternal prayer, heads tilted back in silent screams, ribs exposed where flesh had been methodically stripped away. It was like walking through a museum curated by hell, testified Elizabeth Carver, one of the few who escaped years later. The smell was a mix of chemicals and something sweeter, almost like rotting flowers. "I remember thinking, if this is holiness, then God has abandoned us." But the brothers' real triumph was in how they blurred the boundary between victim and worshipper. Visitors were brought into the Chamber of Saints and told that the displayed remains were to be revered as proof of the spirit's triumph over flesh. Some followers fainted upon seeing the grotesque displays. Others dropped to their knees, sobbing with what they believed was religious ecstasy. And the brothers stood above it all, smiling serenely, knowing they had successfully turned death into sacrament. "It was psychological genocide," said Dr. Garrett, specialist in cult psychology. "They weren't just killing people. They were annihilating the idea that morality, or even reality, existed outside the doctrine." And as the months slipped into 1830, the frequency of the rituals increased. The Ravencrofts introduced quarterly ascensions, then monthly, each with more elaborate tortures and more public spectacles. Outsiders noticed the growing number of disappearances, but when they tried to ask questions, they were met with blank stares or veiled threats from church members who now believed that any interference was the devil's work. By then, Ravenwood was no longer a town in upstate New York. It had become an autonomous zone of madness, governed by three men who believed they held the keys to heaven and who were willing to drown an entire community in blood to prove it. The cruelest prisons aren't built of iron and stone. They're built inside the mind. After the first ascension, the Ravencroft brothers shifted into a phase of their operation that would forever blur the line between religious devotion and organized murder. The rituals now escalated in both frequency and horror. But even more sinister was how the brothers systematically engineered a new reality, one in which pain was language, and torture was worship. The townspeople who had witnessed the deaths of Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters were already psychologically shattered. Elder Ezra seized upon that brokenness with a terrifying brilliance. He began preaching that witnessing the trials was a spiritual honor, a sign that the pure spirit had deemed them worthy of higher understanding. "You have seen the truth," he declared. "Now you must live it." This meant that the congregation itself would no longer be merely observers. They would become participants in the rituals. Followers were assigned roles in the ceremonies, holding torches, restraining victims, chanting invocations as the tortures were carried out. The effect was devastating. The people of Ravenwood were forced to become complicit in atrocities, creating a vicious psychological trap. To admit the evil of what they'd done would mean acknowledging their own guilt. So, instead, they convinced themselves it was holy. "This is one of the most powerful psychological techniques ever used by any cult in American history," said Dr. Garrett, cult psychology specialist. "It's how you get ordinary people to cross moral lines they never thought possible and even defend it as righteous." Meanwhile, Prophet Caleb, his mental state rapidly deteriorating, began to speak of divine anatomy, a theory that specific parts of the human body held unique spiritual energy. He claimed that the spirit did not reside solely in the heart or mind, but was scattered throughout the flesh in secret nodes only he could identify. His visions led to increasingly gruesome experiments in the catacombs. Bodies were dissected not only after death but sometimes while the victims still lived. Elizabeth Carver, who would eventually escape and testify before federal authorities, described stumbling into a hidden chamber and seeing Deacon Silas meticulously recording notes while Prophet Caleb directed the removal of a man's rib cartilage. "The man was awake," she recalled, voice trembling. "He was whispering prayers as they cut into him." Caleb kept repeating, "The spirit must be mapped. The spirit must be mapped." Outside the church walls, Ravenwood had become a ghost town. Trade dwindled. Travelers gave the town a wide berth. Even neighboring communities began to whisper that something monstrous had taken root there. But the Ravencrofts used this isolation as proof of their divine mission. warning that the outside world was under Satan's influence. Anyone who questioned the church was labeled a traitor to the spirit. And still, the congregation stayed. Because to leave meant not only physical danger, but the shattering realization that the faith they'd sacrificed everything for was built on blood and madness. Many preferred to believe the brothers' monstrous gospel rather than face the horror of the truth. By the spring of 1830, said Dr. Thompson, the people of Ravenwood weren't merely victims. They had become willing prisoners in a nightmare of their own making. For the Ravencroft brothers, this was the final triumph. They had built a machine of belief so perfect that it devoured logic, morality, and even self-preservation. And within that machine, the people of Ravenwood marched willingly toward further horrors, convinced that salvation lay just beyond the next scream. When faith becomes a cage, the key is forged from your own screams. As the year 1830 dawned, the Ravencroft brothers stood at the pinnacle of their dominion over Ravenwood. Yet even that absolute power was not enough. Because for Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb, domination wasn't merely about obedience, it was about transforming human souls into raw material for their grand, terrifying experiment. It was during this period that the brothers introduced the doctrine of sacred witness. Elder Ezra proclaimed that true salvation required not only enduring suffering, but witnessing it without flinching. He who can watch agony without turning away, he preached, has transcended the corruption of mortal compassion. For the flesh is weak, but the spirit craves purity. This doctrine forced followers deeper into complicity. Ordinary congregants, many of them farmers, merchants, and mothers, were now required to observe every stage of the 7 trials of purification. The rituals were no longer hidden in catacombs, they were brought into the sanctuary, transforming the church itself into a theater of blood and screams. Survivors described how entire families stood in rows, clutching each other as they watched neighbors, sometimes friends they'd known for decades, bound to inverted crosses, burned, drowned, and flayed in elaborate rites. The screams didn't echo, Elizabeth Carver testified, because the walls seemed to swallow them. But the silence afterward, that silence could crush your ribs. Children were the most vulnerable. Forced to watch these rituals from a young age, many became numb, their eyes vacant. Others wept uncontrollably, only to be punished for faithlessness. Prophet Caleb insisted that a child's soul, if properly conditioned, became the purest vessel of all, a statement that foreshadowed horrors yet to come. Meanwhile, Deacon Silas began integrating anatomical diagrams into his sermons, presenting sketches of human organs labeled not with medical terms, but with cryptic names like chalice of illumination or veil of doubt. He claimed that by mapping these sacred zones, he could unlock the secret of transcendent consciousness. But to chart such territory required living research. One of the most chilling testimonies came from Margaret Wilkins, who wrote in her hidden journal about seeing Silas and Caleb perform dissections on victims who were still alive. "I saw them cut open a man's chest and touch his beating heart," she wrote. "They whispered prayers as he died. And then they smiled, as though they'd glimpsed heaven itself." The ultimate betrayal was how the brothers turned the congregation's own longing for salvation against them. After each elevation, Elder Ezra would deliver sermons reminding everyone that those chosen for suffering are blessed beyond measure. Parents began competing for the honor of offering their children to the rituals, convinced that sacrifice would buy eternal life for their family. "It was a perfect inversion of love," said Dr. Thompson. "They weaponized the deepest human bond, a parent's devotion to a child, to feed their machine of torture." By the spring of 1830, Ravenwood had become a place where the walls seemed to whisper secrets, where the cries of the dying were reinterpreted as hymns of salvation. Outsiders who ventured near reported strange lights flickering from the church steeple at night, accompanied by rhythmic chanting that drifted into the forests like a curse. "There were nights," Dr. Garrett said, "when the entire town seemed to vanish from the map, as though reality itself refused to acknowledge what was happening there. Because in Ravenwood, truth had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a doctrine where pain was enlightenment and murder was the highest act of worship. And the people trapped inside that nightmare weren't just prisoners, they were believers, sacrificing their humanity one ritual at a time. The deepest horror isn't in blood spilled, but in the realization that you wanted it spilled." As 1830 progressed, the Ravencroft brothers entered the final, most blasphemous phase of their doctrine, the belief that death itself could be transcended if only one sacrificed enough to satisfy the pure spirit. This new revelation was the final blade that severed any remaining tether the people of Ravenwood had to sanity. Because now, Elder Ezra began preaching that those who ascended were not merely martyrs, but divine conduits through whom the Spirit could reveal ultimate truths to mankind. It was during this period that Elder Ezra introduced a new, chilling practice: the Whispering Communion. Survivors described how, after an elevation, Prophet Caleb would approach the barely conscious victims, placing his lips close to their ears and whispering words no one else could hear. The victim would convulse, eyes bulging, veins standing out on their temples, before beginning to speak in languages unknown what the brothers claimed was the tongue of angels. "It was a sound that could split your skull," said Elizabeth Carver. High, screeching syllables mixed with guttural roars. It felt less like language and more like something trying to claw its way out of the human body. From these whispered communions, the brothers claimed to extract sacred knowledge. They would then declare new commandments, often requiring more severe tortures or fresh expansions to the catacombs. Some rituals demanded volunteers, others demanded unwilling participants, abducted from neighboring communities or chosen among the congregation itself. Deacon Silas meticulously documented these utterances, filling entire journals with cryptic phrases, anatomical diagrams, and instructions for new experiments. He believed he was mapping the architecture of the soul, convinced that enough data would allow the brothers to separate the essence of human consciousness from the flesh entirely. It wasn't just murder anymore, said Dr. Thompson, historian of religious extremism. It was the deliberate dissection of the human experience, emotion, pain, belief, all transformed into raw material for the brothers' twisted theology. Yet the most horrifying evolution was the Ravencroft's capacity to transform these atrocities into acts of perceived salvation. Survivors reported how Elder Ezra would stand before the congregation, drenched in sweat and fervor, proclaiming that each sacrifice pushed open the gates of understanding. He told them they were on the cusp of a revelation so profound that the angels themselves weep with envy. This belief infected the congregation with a terrible sense of purpose. Ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, mothers began to volunteer for unspeakable rituals. Parents offered their children, believing it was the highest act of love. Those who hesitated were branded as weak, infected by the corruption of the outside world. And in the catacombs, Prophet Caleb's visions became ever more grotesque. Witnesses described him daubing victims' bodies with symbols in blood, muttering that the spirit has secrets to share, but it speaks only through pain. The cumulative effect of these horrors was the complete collapse of moral reality in Ravenwood. The town existed in a state of suspended disbelief. Outsiders who attempted to intervene were met with eerie silence or were simply never seen again. Even those within the congregation began to fracture. Some fell into near catatonic states, unable to process the horrors. Others became fanatical, willing to do anything the brothers commanded. Because the Ravencroft brothers had achieved the ultimate triumph of any cult leader, they had convinced their followers that salvation lay beyond sanity, that truth itself required blood as currency. And once you believe that, there's no atrocity you won't justify. Some nightmares don't end when you open your eyes. They keep breathing in the dark corners of history. The events in Ravenwood did not vanish the moment the last scream died in the stone catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. Instead, they rippled outward like shockwaves, leaving scars that would twist through American history for generations. For even as the Ravencroft brothers perfected their monstrous theology of suffering, they unwittingly set in motion a chain of consequences that would ensure their story never truly died. In the aftermath of the First Ascension and the increasing ritual murders, a few brave souls managed to escape Ravenwood. Among them was Thomas Hartford, the blacksmith whose eyewitness testimony would become the first crack in the brothers' armor. When he finally staggered into the nearby town of Gloversville, frostbitten and half-starved, his ravings were so horrific that local authorities initially thought he'd lost his mind. He spoke of people nailed to inverted crosses, recorded Sheriff William Crosby in his 1830 journal. He spoke of flesh peeled away and spirits speaking in tongues unknown. We thought the man had the fever, until we saw the scars. Even with this testimony, authorities were hesitant to intervene. The Second Great Awakening had left many Americans deeply wary of interfering in religious affairs, fearing accusations of persecution. But rumors began to spread. Traders whispered about the strange quiet in Ravenwood. about entire families vanishing, about a church whose windows glowed red at night. By the end of 1830, Ravenwood had become a place shrouded in legend and terror. Outsiders avoided it altogether. Merchants refused to travel there, and neighboring churches denounced it in fiery sermons. Yet the Ravencroft brothers thrived in this isolation, spinning the town's alienation as proof of divine favor. "The world hates us because we carry the truth," Elder Ezra proclaimed. And truth always demands blood. This chilling narrative seeped into the minds of those who remained. The people of Ravenwood existed in a perpetual state of tension, torn between lingering memories of their old lives and the new reality forged in blood and agony. Margaret Wilkins's journal entries from early 1831 reveal a community where children forget how to laugh, where neighbors fear eye contact, where silence is the loudest sound. Outside Ravenwood, the rumors only grew. Newspaper articles began to appear in Albany and New York City, hinting at a sect of ritual murderers hidden in the forests of upstate New York. The sensational headlines fueled both fear and fascination. Readers craved every lurid detail. Competing papers printed conflicting accounts, some calling it a religious revival gone mad, others suggesting a satanic conspiracy. The Ravencroft brothers' legacy was now escaping the confines of Ravenwood, infecting the broader American imagination. And with it came a subtle, creeping realization if such horrors could unfold in a quiet farming town. How many other secrets might be hidden behind church doors across the country? "This wasn't just a crime," said Dr. Lydia Thompson. "It was a contagion of doubt." People began questioning their pastors, their congregations, even their own faith. The brothers didn't just destroy lives, they cracked open the American psyche. And so the echoes of Ravenwood would not die. Instead, they lingered, surfacing in hushed conversations and fevered nightmares, casting long shadows across pulpits and courtrooms alike. Because beneath the veneer of American piety lay the unthinkable truth that monsters sometimes wore collars, spoke in scripture, and promised salvation through screams. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones whose prayers echo in your memories. By the spring of 1831, the echoes of Ravenwood had grown into something far more potent than rumor. It had become a contagion of fear, one that spread through towns across upstate New York and beyond, infecting churches, communities, and even the corridors of state government. Because no matter how much people tried to dismiss the whispers as wild hysteria, there was always someone who'd heard a story too vivid to ignore, of screams carried on the night wind, of wagons rolling away from Ravenwood heavy with secrets, of men and women who left home seeking God and never returned. The testimonies from escapees like Thomas Hartford and Elizabeth Carver began to filter into the ears of journalists and politicians. Some newspapers printed lurid headlines describing sacred torture chambers, while others tried to downplay the reports, insisting that religious freedom must be protected from scandal. But in quiet conversations behind closed doors, officials were rattled, because the Ravencroft brothers had exposed a truth no one wanted to admit: that evil could wear the face of righteousness, and that doctrine could become a knife pointed at the human soul. "I saw men of faith trembling," wrote Sheriff Crosby in a private letter, "because if it happened in Ravenwood, it could happen anywhere." Meanwhile, the town itself was unraveling from the inside. The Ravencroft's hold remained strong, but fissures were starting to appear. Small groups of followers began questioning the endless rituals, the ceaseless demand for sacrifice. Some tried to leave but vanished before they reached the woods. Others simply disappeared into the catacombs, never to be seen again. Outside Ravenwood, the ripple effect was profound. Ministers in nearby towns began inserting veiled warnings into their sermons, cautioning congregants to beware false prophets who cloak slaughter in the garments of salvation. The phrase Ravenwood doctrine entered public discourse as a shorthand for any religious group suspected of cruelty or secret rituals. Even those who dismissed the more grotesque stories couldn't shake the dread that somewhere, hidden behind hymns and stained glass, other Ravencrofts might be waiting. The psychological toll was immense. Families who had relatives in Ravenwood struggled under a unique torment. Should they try to rescue their loved ones, or leave them behind for fear of being ensnared themselves? Letters arrived in towns like Albany and Schenectady, filled with vague reassurances from those still inside the cult. Yet the language of these letters grew increasingly cryptic, peppered with references to ascensions, purification, and the Spirit's harvest. Margaret Wilkins, whose journals became critical evidence years later, described how the boundaries of reality blurred, It was as if the Ravencroft brothers had reached into my skull and rearranged the shape of my thoughts. Even after escaping, I could still hear Caleb's voice in the quiet. I could smell the oil and blood. And it wasn't just individuals who suffered. Entire communities developed a collective anxiety. Churches lost members who feared organized religion altogether. Parents warned children never to stray near unfamiliar preachers. Lawmakers quietly drafted proposals for new regulations on religious assemblies, measures that clashed directly with America's sacred notion of religious liberty. Yet perhaps the darkest legacy was this: the Ravencrofts had planted a seed of doubt that would never fully die. They had shown the world that belief itself could become the perfect weapon, a blade honed not by steel, but by conviction. And for every soul who escaped Ravenwood, countless others remained behind, trapped in a twisted reality where salvation required blood. The horror of Ravenwood, said Dr. Lydia Thompson, is that it didn't just happen there. It proved how thin the walls are between faith and fanaticism, and how easily, under the right pressure, any community could become Ravenwood. Because the Ravencroft brothers had taught a terrifying lesson that under the guise of holiness, even the most ordinary town could transform into a temple of screams. History doesn't bury monsters, it just changes the locks and pretends they never lived next door. Even as whispers of Ravenwood's horrors spread through New York and beyond, a more insidious aftershock was already unfolding, one that would fracture communities and cast a long, invisible shadow over American religious life. Because the Ravencroft brothers had not simply built a cult, they had revealed a blueprint for how belief could be weaponized, how communities could be torn apart from the inside by faith twisted into fanaticism. In the years immediately following the revelations, officials struggled to contain the fallout. News outlets in Albany and New York City printed lurid exposés about Ravenwood, filled with tales of ritual torture, underground catacombs, and Prophet Caleb's unearthly ravings. But even as these reports dominated front pages, an unsettling question lingered like a fog over the public consciousness. If such horrors could unfold in the quiet forests of upstate New York, how many other Ravenwoods might still be hidden in America's shadows? Church leaders found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. Congregations began shrinking as wary believers questioned the motives of preachers and elders. Religious meetings that once inspired hope now carried an undercurrent of suspicion. People stopped trusting the pulpit, wrote Reverend Samuel Grover of Schenectady. Every sermon felt like it might be the start of something unspeakable. Meanwhile, the testimonies of survivors continued to paint an increasingly disturbing picture of the Ravencroft operation. Margaret Wilkins wrote of how, even after escaping, the memories infected her dreams. She described waking up screaming because I smelled lamp oil and heard chanting, even when I was alone. Elizabeth Carver, who fled in 1832, testified about how the brothers manipulated the most human impulses, love, grief, the desire for meaning, and turned them into shackles. Her words still echo today. They didn't just make us suffer. They made us believe that our suffering was holy. And that was the worst prison of all. As the government quietly investigated other small religious communities, suspicion became a silent epidemic. Federal marshals were dispatched under secrecy to monitor groups showing signs of charismatic leadership or isolation. Lawmakers in New York State debated legislation to increase oversight of religious gatherings, while civil liberties groups warned that such measures could trample the very freedoms that defined America. But the scars weren't only legal or political, they were personal. Families were ripped apart. Parents who had lost children to the Ravencroft cult were plagued by questions that could never be answered. Did their children ascend to a promised heaven? Or were they simply slaughtered for grotesque experiments beneath stone floors? And there was the lingering dread that Elder Ezra or some disciple carrying his doctrine might still be out there, waiting to begin again. We all looked over our shoulders, wrote Thomas Hartford decades later. Because once you've seen monsters who speak in scripture, you can never believe you're safe again. The most chilling consequence, though, was the realization that the Ravencrofts had planted seeds that would continue to grow. Over the next 2 decades, scattered reports surfaced about smaller cults popping up in Ohio, Pennsylvania, even as far as Illinois, groups adopting fragments of the Ravencroft theology, preaching salvation through pain, secrecy, and sacrifice. While none reached the horrifying scale of Ravenwood, each carried the echo of the same dangerous idea that faith could justify anything. The legacy of Ravenwood, said Dr. Lydia Thompson, is that it taught us faith isn't inherently safe. It's a fire, and in the wrong hands, it can burn down the entire world. Because Ravenwood was not just a place, it became a symbol. A reminder that beneath the hymns, beneath the sermons, sometimes lurks a darkness willing to trade human lives for visions of salvation. And that darkness, once unleashed, is nearly impossible to cage again. The terror of Ravenwood didn't end when the doors of the church were sealed. It slithered into the bloodstream of a nation. By 1833, Ravenwood had become more than a physical location. It was a symbol. A whispered warning that faith could mutate into a weapon sharper than any blade. The Ravencroft brothers, though still hidden behind their stone church, had managed to achieve something few cult leaders ever had. They had embedded their nightmare into the American subconscious. As journalists continued to print increasingly graphic details of ritual torture, dissected corpses, and catacombs filled with preserved saints, public fascination transformed into a cultural obsession. Newspapers competed for lurid headlines, describing the church's rituals as an American house of horrors and branding Ravenwood as a place cursed beyond redemption. But what truly haunted the nation wasn't merely the cruelty of the Ravencrofts, it was the nagging fear that this cult was not alone. If it could happen in Ravenwood, it could happen anywhere, became the chilling refrain whispered in taverns, churchyards, and courtrooms alike. Entire denominations found themselves under new scrutiny. Pastors began including disclaimers in sermons, swearing that their churches practiced only true worship, free of hidden rites. Religious tracts flooded the countryside warning of false prophets in sheepskin clothing. Yet each new warning only seemed to deepen the paranoia, because no matter how many preachers protested their innocence, a seed of doubt had been planted that would never completely die. Meanwhile, the families of Ravenwood's victims were left with wounds that time refused to close. Margaret Wilkins, who had escaped but lost friends and family in the church, described living in a permanent twilight. "I'd wake in the night convinced I was still under those stone ceilings," she wrote. "I'd smell blood. I'd hear Caleb's voice, whispering that I was chosen next." Others, like Thomas Hartford, tried to rebuild lives outside Ravenwood. But freedom came at a cost. He became a man hollowed out by memory, unable to hold steady work, drifting from town to town as though fleeing phantoms only he could see. In 1841 he was discovered half frozen in a barn near Utica, still muttering about the catacombs beneath the church. "It wasn't just the murders," said Dr. Lydia Thompson. "It was the psychological infection." People who escaped Ravenwood often carried the cult with them in their nightmares, in their guilt, in their silence. Even broader society began to warp around the invisible pressure of Ravenwood's legacy. Lawmakers introduced bills proposing stricter oversight of religious groups. Civil liberties advocates pushed back, fearing a return to the persecutions of Europe. Debates raged in newspapers and town halls about where the line should be drawn between religious freedom and public safety. The term Ravenwood effect entered American vocabulary to describe a specific kind of fear, the suspicion that behind every charismatic leader might lurk an unseen chamber of horrors. It became a cultural reference point, invoked in discussions of any religious group that grew too insular or secretive. And yet, the paradox of Ravenwood was this: even as the nation recoiled in horror, there were those who felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the darkness. Letters began appearing in newspapers from anonymous writers professing curiosity, even admiration, for the Ravencroft's purity of conviction. Some hinted at seeking out similar groups, convinced that only through suffering can truth be found. That's the final cruelty of Ravenwood. Dr. Thompson concluded. It didn't just destroy the people who were there. It left a permanent echo, a low, relentless whisper reminding us how thin the wall is between belief and oblivion. Because the true horror wasn't merely what happened in Ravenwood. It was the realization that it could happen again. Sometimes the scariest ghosts are the questions that never get answered. By the mid-1830s, the terror of Ravenwood had become an unshakable part of American consciousness. Yet the true scale of its horror would remain concealed for decades, slowly leaking out in fragments, like blood seeping through floorboards long after the crime. Because what Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb had built wasn't merely a cult, it was an invisible infection of the national psyche. A reminder that under the right circumstances, morality itself could be twisted into a weapon. After the initial wave of press coverage, federal authorities began sealing records, fearing mass panic or political scandal. Evidence was locked away in government vaults, accessible only to those with special clearance. Official statements described Ravenwood as an isolated aberration, insisting that America remained a land of religious liberty and moral righteousness. But those who had peered into the catacombs knew better. They knew that once belief was harnessed to justify pain, there was no limit to how deeply it could cut into the human spirit. Even if they burned down the church, wrote Elizabeth Carver in a letter to a friend, you cannot burn away the memories. The screams live in my ears. The smell of oil and blood follows me everywhere. Meanwhile, rumors of Elder Ezra's survival refused to die. Sightings were reported as far away as Chicago and New Orleans. Some claimed to have heard his voice preaching in remote settlements. Others swore he had been seen attending medical lectures under a false name. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, who spent the last years of his career chasing these rumors, concluded in a private journal that Elder Ezra may have escaped, not only physically, but ideologically, seeding new versions of himself wherever people thirsted for secret truths. And so the question lingered. Was Ravenwood truly over? Or was it only sleeping, waiting for the next charismatic voice to speak its gospel of suffering? This uncertainty began to feed new obsessions. Writers and journalists in the burgeoning penny press latched onto the Ravenwood story as proof that beneath America's gleaming promise lay a bottomless pit of darkness. Novels, pamphlets, and cautionary tales emerged, each dramatizing the horrors of cult manipulation, secret rituals, and the possibility that your neighbor's church might harbor catacombs of hidden cruelty. Yet amid the growing cultural fascination, a deeper wound was festering, the psychological legacy carried by those who survived. People like Margaret Wilkins, who managed to build a quiet life in Albany, confessed in her later years that she still checked behind every door before sleeping. It's not that I think Ezra's there, she told a young journalist in 1855. It's that I know someone like him always will be. For law enforcement, Ravenwood became a ghost story told in hushed tones. A cautionary tale passed from one generation of investigators to the next. Young marshals were warned that some cults don't die, they simply change their names and move into new towns. Because the true genius of the Ravencroft brothers wasn't only in their cruelty, but in their understanding that once you convince people that suffering leads to salvation, you have them forever. As the decades rolled on, small religious enclaves across the country were quietly monitored, any sign of charismatic leadership scrutinized for hints of hidden doctrine. And yet, each time authorities tried to intervene preemptively, critics cried out about civil liberties, warning that America's soul depended on the freedom to believe, even if that belief sometimes led to horror. The final victory of Ravenwood, Dr. Lydia Thompson observed, is that they left us permanently unsure where faith ends and fanaticism begins. Because in the end, the Ravencrofts proved a truth as chilling as any dark forest or blood-soaked altar, that the human need for meaning, for transcendence, can become the sharpest blade of all. And even now, more than a century later, we're left asking, how close are we, really, to the next Ravenwood waiting to rise? Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. But it's in remembering the past that we keep it from becoming the future. The story of Ravenwood and the monstrous gospel of the Ravencroft brothers reminds us that darkness doesn't always announce itself with monsters and shadows. Sometimes, it wears a smile, a sermon, and the promise of salvation. The real terror lies in how easily conviction can become cruelty, and how faith, twisted just enough, can make monsters of ordinary people. Yet even as we stare into the abyss of these horrors, there's something crucial: we must hold onto the power of knowledge. Because each time we shine a light into history's darkest corners, we weaken the shadows that seek to hide there. Knowing is the first step to freedom. Silence is where monsters thrive. For those who've watched this far, you're not just consuming a story, you're carrying forward a legacy of vigilance. The ghosts of Ravenwood whisper so that we remain watchful, questioning, unwilling to surrender our minds to any voice that demands blind obedience. And in that questioning, there is hope. So as we close the chapter on Ravenwood tonight, remember, the greatest defense against the next cult, the next hidden chamber, is a mind that refuses to sleep. Let this story stay with you not as a wound, but as armor. Let it remind you to look deeper, to ask harder questions, to never accept any truth that demands your silence or your suffering. And now, I have a question for you. Do you believe Ravenwood was the only secret buried in America's past? Or do you think others remain hidden, waiting to be discovered? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm reading every single one, because together, We're piecing together the forgotten horrors of our history. If this tale gripped you, if it made you question the line between faith and fanaticism, hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves diving into true crime, cult horror, and forbidden history. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because here, we're not done digging. There are so many more secrets waiting beneath the surface. History doesn't repeat itself, unless we let it. Let's make sure Ravenwood remains a warning and never a blueprint.